For the colloquium, but this is a colloquium, Jordan Center, and to review briefly how it is we go about things, we have a text which has been pre-circulated. The presenter understands that this is a work in progress and therefore open to criticism. We understand it's a work in progress and therefore we're civil and polite, but nevertheless substantive. The purpose of it is to help the text become a better text. I want to go into deep introductions. You can introduce yourself and your work as you see fit. Or usually you can just talk about your, where this belongs in a larger project.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Oh, thanks for coming. Well, so I'm actually extremely excited to be here because I haven't actually circulated anything to Russian studies people, Russian historians. I mean, I've talked to anthropologists a lot, but no regional, really specialists. So I'm really curious to see what you'll say. This is also an attempt to write an introduction to a book manuscript that's not yet finished, and I've written some articles, but I've never written a book, and hence I've never written an introduction. So one of my questions is, does it actually work to introduce a book, and does it make you want to read the book?
Yes.
Yes. Good. Okay. Check. So I mean, just a few words about the project. Basically, this it's a project that grew out of another project that failed, sort of happily. And as I started collecting all these things that people had made from industrial scrap and smuggled out of plants, and as they talked about it, I actually took seriously the ethical stakes that they had, the ethical claims they were making about how this stuff isn't, how stealing for private interest is bad, but this stuff isn't stolen, it's just gotten. And it seemed like this ethical stance they were associating with Soviet times, even when they were describing events that happened way after the Soviet Union collapsed in the mid to late 1990s. And then when I actually went back into civil law, I realized that actually this isn't just nostalgia for the Soviet Union. Actually, these are ethical claims that are completely grounded in the specifically socialist relations of property law, which grounded the Soviet Union as a socialist household and as a household economy. So really, then the book is a historical ethnography of an industrial modern state ran as a household. And of the sort of property relation that made this possible, it's a specifically non-private way of relating individual interests to the greater common good. And it's based on a sacred monopoly of socialist property, a sacred monopoly which was established in 1936, officially by the Constitution, and which held all the way through Gorbachev's perestroika reforms. And so the book traces sort of how this was established, how it functioned, how it fell apart. And then it really is about how this relationship is remembered and what the history of this particular relationship says to the history of liberalism, as we know it, late liberalism as we know it today, which of course is very much based on the private being sort of the natural way of relating individual interests to the common good in at least a state market society. And I think one of the ways that we get to this late liberal moment is the place that neoliberal theorists is the image of totalitarianism that neoliberal theorists use to justify their own project. Right? This idea that if the state controls private property, it will control private interests, it will control your relationships to your spouses, your God, your truth, and all this stuff. So it's also sort of a longer history told from the liberal position that we've all gotten ourselves into of this other project, which seems to have failed, but actually nobody actually looked at how it worked. I don't know what I should say. On a sort of a broader theoretical level, what I'm trying to get after is this other way of relating to the commons, this not specifically non-private personal way. And the interesting thing, one of the interesting things about it is that it is actually legislated as the individual stake for commons. And that individual sort of right, the personal right to profit from the commons, comes with the personal obligations to further the collective good. So it is both an ethical regime and a property regime. And this especially becomes pertinent after the 1960s, where the ethic of comradely mutual aid becomes sort of the way that communism would be constructed. And this is where I get the title of the book, Gleaning for the Common Good, because this is factually a planned economy that doesn't actually work according to plan, as has been noted over and over and over again. If everybody just followed the plan, the thing would stall overnight and nothing would get to where it needed to go. So it was actually reliant on this ethic by which everybody broke the law, factually, everybody from high-level managers and pushers, like what Joseph Berliner had been writing about already in the 50s, and what comes up in all these oral histories of Stalin-era management, all the way down to just factory workers taking stuff home from the plants for their own personal use. And if that breaking the law could be framed in terms of the collective good, then it was an ethical good. If it was framed in terms of acquisitive interest, then it was bad. And so it's this ethical, ideological distinction that's at the center of this property regime. And interestingly, I'm about done talking. Interestingly, one thing that's not in the introduction is that I recently found the first time that this property regime, this socialist, the sacred monopoly on socialist property is called the sacred monopoly in socialist law. And I know it's the first time because scholars of civil law, Soviet scholars of civil law, a year later are celebrating it as the origin of socialist property. This is the 1932 law against Gleaning.
Against what?
Gleaning. It's right. So for those of you who aren't professional experts, in 1932, this draconian anti-theft law was passed that literally punished peasants for gleaning grain. We punished all theft of socialist property with death or with 10 years incarceration. But what it was punishing was theft for private use. And in that law, it's not yet called socialist property because that term has not yet really emerged. It's called collective property. But for the first time, it's called sacred. It's called the sacred monopoly. And civil scholars already in 1933 are celebrating it as the origin of a fundamentally new property regime. And indeed, in 1936, it is constitutionally declared to be the sacred basis of the Soviet order. And in that same move, the Constitution, as it declares socialist property, this commons to be the sacred basis of the Soviet order, it also gives all Soviet citizens personal rights, including the right to personal property, which is an explicitly non-private way of having a personal stake in this.
Within the context of state property.
Huh?
Within the context of state property, you can have personal property.
That's it. Socialist property, interestingly, the term state property had existed it had existed since 1918, but then in 1936 there's this new relation called socialist property, which includes basically everything,
Right.
including personal property. Because before, of course, like before private citizens were recognized to be private individuals, and so your private property was not state property,
Right.
and there was that distinction. After 1936, there is no distinction.
Right. We'll come back to that. Right, Ben.
Okay, so I guess that's all I have to say.
So to sort of summarize your argument then,
Yeah.
if the way I took out of this and what you're saying right now, your argument is basically that socialist property in this case produces certain things, but it's not what it doesn't allow, but it actually allows certain things. It allows the development of a certain ethical subculture at the same time, which is kind of compatible. Right? So if someone were to say, but this is a society which is not working according to its laws, you would say, actually, it does work.
Yeah.
Right? And the formal law is not necessarily the main thing we should be looking at.
Yeah.
Would that be the...
Yeah, absolutely. And it's especially because, I mean, the whole point of the Soviet project, right, so it's a household. And it's a household in motion. It's going somewhere. It's like the market economy is sort of headless. It just sort of circulates. But the household is thriving. And it's thriving for a recognized goal for the construction of communism. And in communism, the state will wither away. So there will be no law. It will be an ethical relation. So in a way, that ethical relation, it's supposed to supersede. And definitely in the 60s, that is the way it's explicitly written. There's a new civil code, the 1964 Civil Codex, and as important civil scholars like Yofe are explaining it, they actually say, well, now we have a moral codex also. We've got the moral codex of the builders of communism, and that should be the fundamental law of citizens in the way they relate to each other, which should actually supersede their legal obligations.
So some people would look at this and they say, well, that's chaos, right? In the sense that it's not ordered by law, it's not normative, it allows for all this space of choice, personal choice, ethics, as you put it. What would you say to that?
Well, it's not chaos. It is ordered. I mean, that's the fundamentally interesting thing. Is that the moral codex of the builders of communism is written into law. It's just written as a super law. So and this ethical regime of collectivism, it itself comes out of the property regime. So it's exactly not society against the state. it's, because that's the other claim that's been made
Right,
often, right? Is
right.
that, well, Soviet people needed to fight the state basically to live. No, it's actually, I mean, it's society fighting with the collective. Like, maybe, you know, sometimes going around the laws when need be. But it's not, private and public are opposed relationships. Something can either be, you know, this is my private thing, it's not ours. It's not yours, it's mine. But the personal, it's mine only because it's ours. So the personal and the socialist, they co-constitute. Right? And so it only makes sense kind of as an ethical relation. But on the other hand, we see this relation in all sorts of other contexts, so it's actually not, it's not that crazy. I mean, this sort of is the property relation that we get in households.
The floor is open. This is Betty Banks,
Right.
doctoral student.
So I have many questions. So what then, when, I guess my question I have is when, because you're writing about your ethnography, like your time was like in the present day, and you're writing about the Soviet regime, and then you're identifying this kind of break in the 2010s when there's kind of a process, it's sort of like where gleaning seems to switch to kind of stealing, and where it switches to a, like whether your people are contrasting the kind of like the gleaning for the common good against this kind of like Gazprom. They're stealing for their own interests. But in a way then, the way that, I guess this is kind of like what people have written about, like in those, you know, those people who have written about the shadow economy being like the state versus like people fighting against the state, in a way the behavior is kind of is similar, right? So then so you have like both the ethical regime coexisting with this legal regime where technically it is illegal to like glean or steal, except that gleaning is somehow acceptable among under the ethical regime. But then this break comes, right? So the break comes like temporally in the 2010s according to your interlocutors, but then also does it come kind of historically under the Soviet socialist regime where time, like when people were prosecuted still, were people prosecuted still? Maybe that's my real question. For breaking this law that technically exists when in fact that they were like acting according to ethical guidelines. Because this seems like, I know that, I mean the other cases, the Soviet, like the Brezhnev era regime used certain laws like as kind of discipline techniques that's like everyone's breaking it and then they would use it if you happened to be a dissident, right? So
so I didn't at all mean to say that the break comes in 2010. Although I did do my ethnography in the 2010s. I mean, that is sort of the break with the Soviet Union falling apart, but it's not. It doesn't. Even that isn't really a clean break because, interestingly, the 1990s are most commonly remembered as both Soviet and perestroika. Even though they're neither,
right.
Actually. So that first post-socialist decade is the one that seems to be most remembered as both of these, because both of those claims actually that to perestroika and to the Soviet, they're claims about a moral economy. The way I heard them. So that, when you sort of people started talking about, Soviet times, from an economic standpoint, it was about how times were tough, but we helped each other out, and, we got a lot of stuff through the plant, and thank God the plant was there, otherwise we really would have been in dire straits, and yada, yada, yada. It's basically informal, non-financial, non-fiscal distribution, right? Of course, a lot of that was going on in the really tough first post-Soviet decade, right? And when they talked about perestroika, it was the same thing, but seen from the opposite standpoint. So perestroika is a totally immoral time, everybody stole everything, yada yada. But they're actually talking about the same exchanges, just from two different viewpoints, right? So basically, if you were part of, because there's two great moments of dispossession, between which I want to position this book, right? The first great moment of dispossession is the enclosure of the commons by the state to produce the sacred monopoly of socialist property. The second great moment of dispossession is post-Gorbachev perestroika reforms, when this commons becomes ethically dispossessed. Basically, the perestroika reforms allow collectives to use socialist property for the collective good of their own particular collective. right? And if everybody does this, the monopoly falls apart. And then this sort of keeps going through the 90s. There's a lot of socialist property to be obtained in various forms. And depending on where people stand in relation to the collective that benefited from the obtaining, they will say, well, either it was perestroika or it was Soviet. Which actually goes back to your second question, is well, prosecuted? Yes, of course. So this specific, what I'm after is a, it's sort of in the eye of the beholder. It's a point of view. It's not so much a legal question, although it is that also, because of course ethics is in the law, which is so interesting here. But it's a moral question. So that, for example, you're talking about the Soviet times, I would have two informants talk about the same person. Somebody who likes this person will say, well, she never stole, I know that. But you could get anything, because, for example, this woman is a high-level officer who could get train tickets. Of course, she used the privileges that her position afforded her, and he, for example. Another person who doesn't like this woman would say, haha, the hell she didn't. I'd come over and I'd see like jars of black caviar. That's why she didn't steal. So it's just whether you like, it has to do with whether you're sympathetic. But this also then means that if you were sympathetic, then there was a way to frame this exchange as a positive good, which allowed the whole system to keep going. Yeah.
Katie David, another doctoral student.
Right.
Yeah, so I wanted to follow up on that because I also did, when I read this, did see that you were trying to say something about the 2010s as some sort of break, that there was something new going on in the present, as it was the present of your of your research. So I don't know, it's just something to think about how you're framing it.
Sure.
But I think something that just came up when you were presenting your work is that you wanted to contrast nostalgia with this ethical repertoire, or the ethical stakes, and that it's not just nostalgia, that there's something, that this is actually something different. But I wanted to just ask, because in the paper, or in the introduction, you talk about something and use a term that I really liked, which was popular historiography, as opposed to memory. And I think, and this gets a little bit at what Betty was saying, because one of the things that you're doing is, even though you're doing an ethnography of the present, you're talking about how people remember the Soviet times, and then sort of the ethical stakes of how they remember it. And I think that is something that has to do with sort of popular understandings of history and where breaks are, as opposed to memory, which I think wouldn't really apply to what you're talking about. But I wonder how quickly you can dismiss terms like nostalgia, because I mean, with ethics there is that element to it of kind of, well, ethics sort of come with it, this idea of how things ought to be, how things were. And I think that nostalgia can come into a lot of ethical stakes. So I just
that's totally fair. I hesitate to use nostalgia because one of the definitions of nostalgia is a yearning for a past that never was. And what's interesting is a lot of these narratives that I had heard seemed to fit that, they were sort of, sunshine narratives of the Soviet Union. Like, okay, well, that's clearly the past that never was. But actually, if you take seriously the ethical claim that these narratives are making, it's actually there in civil law. So actually, it is also an expression of a past that was.
But the ethics of it, I guess, also is sort of an idealized. I mean, there is an idealized version of things as well.
But what ethics would not be idealized? I mean,
so that's what I agree with. So I'm just saying that I think that,
should do more of a nostalgia.
Well, I just think that, because ethics are something that, as you said, what ethics would not be idealized. You're talking about ethics in a sense of ethics that existed.
Yeah.
But there is still an ideal that is being thought of.
Right.
And the ethics only existed as an ideal also, right?
No, they actually existed in practice.
Yeah, no, but in practice, they existed as an ideal because moved forward motion to communism.
But collectivism was the way we would get to communism. It was also the instantiation of communism today. it was also practically the way this damn thing worked. You know? So there was sort of, people had an invested personal reason for acting collectively. So, I mean, ethics, yes, of course it's idealized, but in the sense that any ethical claim is a claim about how ideally people should act.
Right, and if people acted this way, it would bring about something.
Well, I mean, but it's so we make ethical claims about how people should act ideally. You know, if somebody is doubting your motivation for doing it, like if I don't like you, I might say, well, actually, her motivation was not this idealized motivation, it was something else. But that is also, I would also be driven by another ideal. So, I mean, in a way, I guess, I mean, I have a hard time putting that sort of idealism together with the idealism of nostalgia because, I mean, the past that never was seems to be a sort of an image of a system, whereas the idealism of ethics just seems to be, well, that is, any ethical claim would do this.
Right.
I think you're saying that a past that never was is a truism. That's always the case, right? I think well, I think what you're aiming toward is memory, right? The way we understand it in historiography, meaning how we look at the past, and it's not unreal. Nor does it matter if it's real or unreal. It's more how we put together the pieces to have, you know what I mean, hate and white. In our field, it would be Fred Corney. Is that what you're aiming to? You're thinking of, or beckoning toward?
Yeah, I think I'm just trying to think of that framework in the idea of this popular historiography that you mentioned, because you're talking about ethics and about specific historical moments. So I think that just, but this is so great because it brings all of that up. So, and I don't want to press you.
No, but that's I mean, that's a good point. I perhaps should have done more, could do more with nostalgia and memory, especially because memory studies is such a big, like, cesspool of, you know,
It's what?
a big cesspool of stuff.
So that's why I like that you use these other terms. I think they work well.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Brendan Schechter, you know Brendan.
Yeah.
So, let me just, two quick questions.
Yeah.
One is that in describing this, I sometimes found myself asking, how is this different than Blot? Particularly Fitzpatrick's article on Blot, where it's like, you know, when somebody else is doing it, you know, like them, it's Blot, when it's me, it's my friend. The other is, I understand that there's no clear, that there's like this amorphous border between Soviet times and perestroika, or Soviet times, post-Soviet times. Are there any sort of consensus, or even just kind of like frequently appearing contenders for a marker between these two that come up on my plate? Is Putin seems somewhat important to this story the way that you're telling it, but I'm just wondering if in the ethnographies people like point to something that happens, whether on a local or national level, where they're like, for them this is
when Soviet times were definitively dead.
Right.
So that's a really super interesting point. Well, let me try to answer that one first. You know, not that I can think of. I actually had people say Soviet. I mean, they would not with a grain of salt, but when describing present-day practices, like especially when I started asking sort of business owners and managers about how they got around the law, so like, you know, how they got around inspections and stuff like that, and I would say, well, you know, I'm interested in the way today's economy works, and I've had a couple of people say, well, I don't know what you want from us, we're a Soviet firm. And I was like, that's odd, how do you mean that? And what they meant was that they are, you know, a small firm mostly getting like state contracts or like hospital contracts. There was this one firm making like kind of specialized hospital equipment, and you know, they basically meant we're not really on the market. We sort of do this other thing, like sort of a more of a patient client kind of like established sort of thing. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know. So a way I could not answer that and talk about something else that might be related is Gorbachev is a super interesting creator because he is sort of either loved or hated, and his reforms are routinely sort of in a way misrecognized. So like that's a bad term to say, but they're read in a really interesting way, sort of from all around on all different sides of the spectrum. So he is usually in Russia, kind of in this folk historiography sort of way, he is read as, his reforms are read for like ethical reforms, ideological reforms, political reforms, so good or bad. and sort of in like Anglophone academia also. And, and actually his was an economic reform project, which isn't really either remembered or analyzed as an economic reform project. I think the economic historians don't analyze it as an economic reform project because it makes no sense. From the standpoint of private property, it makes absolutely no sense. I mean, it implements like individual trade, but it doesn't implement free market prices. I mean, it could not have possibly worked. But it makes total sense if you look at the third-party platform of 1961, which is what Gorbachev's reformers were all thinking with. That's all what they were schooled in, and in a way, his reforms are just the next step. On the ground in Russia, I think Gorbachev isn't remembered as an economic reformer because it seemed like that was sort of the ethical speed up. Because all suddenly a lot of possibilities were suddenly available, and everything had not yet fallen apart. So in a way, Gorbachev is sort of he's like an important figure in the death of everything, and definitely people who don't like him definitely blame him for having killed the Soviet Union for private interest. They say he was in cahoots with Western capital and all this stuff. So maybe potentially I could say Gorbachev. Which is interesting because then they will say Gorbachev killed the Soviet Union, and then they will go on to describe all of these the way things were in Soviet times, and they'll be talking about 1994. And somehow that's okay. But to your first question about blood and whether this is blood, in a way, yeah. What's interesting though about blood, shadow economies, second economies, is that's a way of seeing all these transactions from the standpoint of the negative. So basically, blood is what people ought not have done. And the thing is,
blood, for those who don't know, is connections, using connections.
Traffic of influence.
Sort of using influence to get stuff done. But said from the position of somebody who does not like you. So
Do your folks use this term?
blood, yeah, and now they use it positively, actually often. Like she's got pull, he's got blood. Yeah. So yes, blood. But the problem is if you focus on what people ought not have done, you will not see how the system works. Actually, you will, because negative definitions don't actually tell us anything. Like you are not a giraffe, and I am not a giraffe. But that tells us nothing about what we share. It doesn't really describe us at all. So, like everybody can agree that blood was bad, and they didn't do blood. Like, so what? So if you focus, what I've tried to do instead is focus on the positive heroic narratives. And sort of the way these heroic positive narratives are framed, the way people frame themselves performing factually illegal stuff when they're talking about themselves, and hence describing the system from an ethically idealized position. People like to present themselves in a way that makes them look good, generally. Right? And if you do that, then actually you see that, because if you look at blood, it seems like society against the state. People were stealing from the state to keep everything going. If you look at it in the positive way, you actually see that it's society with the commons, at least, and sort of all striving together. And that the terms they draw on when talking about the way they actually get stuff done is actually very much what socialist civil law would tell them to do, ethically. Thanks for the question.
I have a very frivolous question and a more serious question. So the frivolous one is, why do you have Victor Tsoi as a quote in the very beginning? And the other one is about, how do you see a model working differently in guild situation versus personal situations? Because you give us examples
Did you say guild?
I'll explain what I mean. Like, you give us examples of small companies operating within this kind of ethical, moral framework, and people explaining their own private kind of actions in that manner. And I think it worked for the Soviet Union as well, because there are cases, like recently there was another workshop where there was a case of like this kind of illegal operation, kind of institutional operation of producing materials for years, where many people were involved, that possibly was considered ethical at the time, but then people were arrested. It was found out that people were arrested. And kind of in my own work, I work on like the filmmakers union, and a lot of cultural unions, they operated largely as their own economies, being able to earn money themselves and they give some to the state. But then when exactly the same procedures that they were that they were doing as a guild was done by an individual, then that individual was caught and punished.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah.
So like, I just wonder whether this ethics works better on an individual level, or whether it's a remnant of some kind of institutional practice that was common in the Soviet Union, like at least in the post-colonist times.
Yeah. So if I understand, correct me if I misunderstood you. If I understand you correctly, the thing is with the guild, it's a collective. Right? Right? So if you are going around the law to get stuff for the collective, that's good, right? And the sort of collectivist image that they had, at least after the 1960s, is the socialist household was a collective, made up of first of fractal multiplicity, sort of, think of like Pascal's fractal triangle, of smaller collectives, all striving together and all co-constituting each other. And all of these little households, they're basically like household collectives, right? All these little households were tied to each other in the relations of entitlement and obligation. So they would each get a quota of socialist property, be entitled to a quota of socialist property and obligated to manage that quota appropriately. But the problem is, of course, it doesn't work. And so there's this gap of indeterminacy that opens between the quota of socialist property to which one is entitled and the way that the stuff that actually fills that quota. And that gap could be personally managed. And this is where the collectivist ethic comes in, the ethical obligation to further the collective good. So as long as you're doing it for a collective, it's good. And the idea is, well, as long as, in this household economy, if you don't get your film stock, then you can't make the films and you can't distribute them to me and I can't show them, and so it's good that all the collectives get that stuff. But as soon as you take it down to the level of the individual, then it's just private interest, right? Because there's no collective, it's just you. And then that's bad, because that's selfish. So sort of selfish interest is the thing that haunts this system and cannot be, of course it's always there, right? But it can't be said to be there.
Can't be named.
It can't be named.
Yeah.
Can't be named. But interestingly, sort of, the other thing I could say about that is that, well, in a way, this is sort of a relation that we see all over human sociality. We live in households, right? And when we have sort of household-like, non-private, non-market societies, it is this question of selfish interest that haunts. There's this great book by Nancy Munn called The Fame of Gawa about Papua New Guinea, I think, where it sort of works on this very much a gifting economy and an economy of fame and it's sort of spreading, name and fame spreading in space-time. And the thing that haunts is the witch, which is literally selfish private interest, which flies around at night and eats people selfishly, which is very much like the speculant in the Soviet Union. But then sort of just jumping ahead, if you have a society that sort of runs on private interest, like sort of today's America, then the thing that haunts is personal, it's corruption. And with corruption, the mafia, it's an ethical relation. Right? if you are a made man in the family, you can sort of get goods from that secret collective, right? But you're also supposed to give yourself selflessly to further that collective good.
Right, but there's some slippage between like the kinds of loyalties that are available. Because national loyalty versus filmmakers unions loyalty versus your family versus your friends. Like there's a different. Even in American history, this is also studied. Like there's this kind of abstraction that needs to be done to be loyal to the nation. That's completely different from your loyalty to your family and your friends. And it seems to me that these moral imperatives that you're talking about, they must work differently on all of these different levels.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. But interestingly, again, in the sort of post-60s moment, these collectives are said to nestle officially, right? So there is an official collectivism. So there is in an unofficial collectivism. But in a way, all collectivism is good because it's sort of assumed to build onto the greater household. So one of the ways they sort of bring ethics into law is they revived this institution which they had in the 1920s called the Comrades Court. And these are sort of quasi-juridical institutions. They look like courts. It very much varies the way people ran these things, but often it actually looks very much like a court. They're staffed by non-juridically educated people, just like your neighbors, for example, or your co-workers. And they try minor misdemeanors based on moral grounds. And so really based on collectivist grounds. But on the other hand, this is like your check writes about this, right? And this has sort of come up a lot, is that people also live collectively. So that, if the institution tells us we need to have a meeting of the comrades court to judge you, for example, because you haven't been coming to work and you're just a no good neck, then we might do it, but we might tell you ahead of time, listen, don't take it personally. What you're going to do doesn't won't really matter. Right? So there's this way that the personal collective could trump the formal collective, but it's kind of a fractal recursion because the collectivist ethic is actually the same. Oh, and soy. I really like that quote because so if any of you haven't read the paper, I'll read it to you. It's my translation, so it might not be great. But I wander around by myself. I just wander around, and I don't know what to do with myself. And there's nobody home. There's no one home. Nobody's home. I'm as left over as a pile of scrap metal. It's 1982. I mean, the great thing is, a pile of scrap metal is actually very useful. as people, in the people that I talked to, definitely knew because they were making everything out of it, like kayaks, knives, sauerkraut tubs, you name it, they made it. But also during perestroika, that scrap metal is going to become a lot of market value for certain collectives. I also started with it because I don't know how much this works. Maybe I should have a different introduction, but I wanted some sort of, it's an anthropological book, so it needs like an ethnographic vignette. And so I wanted, I've been struggling to write in a way that sort of writes from an ethnographic eye, which isn't the eye of, like in this article, I will argue that, but it's sort of, again, it's like an anthropological thing. It's sort of the eye of, well, there I was talking to these people, and it made me think of this philosophy over here, and let me tie this all in through the archives, and it's sort of an eye that has authority because it did field work. So I was trying to put myself in the text more, and in one way I did try to do that is by sort of honestly telling the failure that began this project and the way I wound up here, and so, that sort of aimless wandering in the surplus time, and it's sort of me aimlessly wandering. It's also people had a lot of time on their hands, and so I don't know if it works. It might not work.
When you say ethnographic as opposed to anthropological, what do you mean exactly? What are the stakes in calling it that?
You mean what I just said, or in general?
Or in the text as well?
In the text as well.
You call it an ethnographic study, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know, I've been accused of not really doing ethnography, oddly, even though other people tell me I write pretty good ethnography, so I don't know where and stuff between those two things. But a lot of it became, as I was trying to make the dissertation into a book, a lot of it became sort of a study of the history of social civil law. So I'm sort of, in a way, I'm sort of trying to like reground myself in ethnography, because for an anthropologist that's important. But also,
So for ethnography and anthropology are interchangeable in this case? Is that right?
Well, no, I think anthropologists would say, well, ethnography is the method, whereas anthropology is the discipline. So you could be a historical ethnography and not actually do it, historical anthropologist and not actually do any ethnography. But actually, I think this is one of the things I'm trying to say is that this actually is a profoundly ethnographic text that I'm trying to write, because the reason that I could see that in the archive, or in sort of the text of scholars of civil law, this ethical claim, is because I heard it repeatedly as I was talking to people about what they thought the Soviet was. And it's really that sort of, my desire to take their claims seriously comes out of the ethnographic fieldwork. So sort of me repeatedly saying ethnography is an attempt to ground it. But I think maybe I should be more explicit about that.
So there's I had thoughts or reactions. By the way, I liked it very much. I think it's in very good shape. I thought the arguments were clear. I understood they're getting certain areas will be clarified, but what you want to do is wait until you finish writing the chapters, and then you'll know what the introduction is more about, which is the usual thing. But I still liked it very much as a text. And it was subtle, it sort of took us through things, not really pounding us in the head American style, but also letting us imagine a little bit, and sort of, I think it worked very nice, both stylistically and substantively. Small things, very, very small. I'm not sure about the first two paragraphs, if that's a good way to open it. I don't know what anyone else thinks. But it was a nice story. but it distracted me from the argument. It took me a while to get to the argument. This was just my reaction to it. Maybe I'm too literal also in what I'm thinking. Because then when we start getting into the later paragraphs, it grabbed me immediately. Right? So I was drawn into it, I understood exactly what this is about. That was my reaction to it. Maybe anyone else had some reactions to that about how the whole project is introduced. I understood it as a metaphor also. That was my reaction. See what others say as well. And now, since we came to a bunch of historians, we're gonna sort of, when we start splitting hairs, and take it as you will, right? Sort of, it's not. I don't think, we approach things differently, and we understand sequences differently. So there's the question of two questions. One of them is Tim Mitchell's argument about the invention of the economy, right? Thankfully he's not a historian because he could imagine, right? And he has he could think of things that historians, being too grounded, couldn't have, but he did come up with this basic argument. The economy is a place that was created, it was like a space that was created, and we began to look at it as something which could be acted upon, and it becomes something that you can fix and change and manipulate. And he places this basically in the 1930s, right? So the great criticism we got from all the historians was, no, we saw this in the 1890s, for example. Народное хозяйство is used in the 1890s, as you know yourself. Volkswirtschaft is used in the 1850s. Nationalökonomie is used in the 1830s. So it became one of these sort of important but not really important debates over when this happens. The real point is that it does happen at some point. It's a creation, it's comes into being. And so the way I use Tim Mitchell is I avoid ascribing dates to him. I leave that part out so we can actually talk about the very good ideas that he has. Right? This is just, historians' nerdish reaction to sociologists. Right? There was that.
Can I interrupt us a question? So, yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Meaning because there's no worth having the argument.
Sure.
Yeah.
The reason that I even use the dates is that it's such a beautiful parallel. Because of course the socialistic хозяйство, the socialist household, if you follow Tim Mitchell, it's like amazingly parallel. They're like historical twins, but maybe that's so. I just to clarify, the economy from the 1890s. You mean specifically that which is neither the political realm of the state nor the private realm of the household.
That's right.
That's right. Okay, so good.
It's the way you describe it.
Good to know.
It's an optic for understanding all relations, right, with an economic lens.
Yeah.
And in that sense, it's alongside nation, it's alongside state, it's alongside society, it's alongside culture. It's one of the many ways being developed to look at everything, right, systematically and comprehensively, right. And the other one is about the private property. So there's this debate, knock yourself out, but there's a lot that's been written about private property, public property, state property, there's a debate also in the American historiography as well about what all these terms might apply in one time or another. And in the Russian case, there's the ultimate argument that under autocracy, theoretically, the autocrat is the owner of everything, right? Theoretically. And the autocrat does have the right to intervene, not so much as eminent domain, but as the ultimate owner, right? To take things away, to redistribute them. It's done as political punishment. It's done as in various guises. But there is an institution of private property, which is abolished in 1970 and 1980. Right.
It's on the books, though. Early Soviet civil law does have private property. This is one of this causes a huge problem for correspondents of civil law. Huge problem because it's in an unequal relationship to state property. It recognizes private rights, but they're not absolute.
So a lot of the terms that they started using it in imperial times was personal property, right? And which is and they begin to turn to that because it's a little more diffuse, right? It doesn't have the sense of absolute right, and you begin to see it in Stolypin's legislation, for example. And mainly with agrarian reform, precisely because they don't want private property rights for peasants, because you don't want to give peasants too many rights, because they want reform, right? And you can't change them, right? And then we go into Soviet times, and then you have the wave of nationalizations going all the way through 1919, basically. It begins with all rural property, and then goes into urban property, and so that theoretically anything can be taken away, and in that sense it's not really private, it may be individual. It may be individualized, which is I think what you're getting at.
Right.
It may be individuated, right? But private property is an absolute right to have something. So then the MEP is a series of concessions, right? But within the system of state property already.
But interestingly, at least for the scholars of civil law, there is this term private property, and it causes them quite a lot of...
The Russian term?
Russian term, chestnut.
Chestnut.
Yeah, and it causes them quite a lot of theoretical grief, in a way, exactly because it's not absolute, right? And so, so actually, interestingly, Stuchka, for example, Peter Stuchka, he in like early 30s, he basically writes, what we're building here is the usufruct economy. We have civil law, right? But really, private property and state property are in such a relationship that they can't be even theorized in the same terms of ownership, because state rights are always absolute and private property rights are not. But it's still important to, I think, for me to think of it as private property, because they think of it as private property, and it causes them a lot of problems about what you do, for example, with private consumption, because all this time, all Soviet citizens are recognized as private individuals who need to eat. They need to get stuff, they need clothes, they need food, and so every time they consume that retail sale, well, officially it's chipping away at the state monopoly. And still in 1932, they're very ambiguous about this. I mean, they're like, well, the most they can say is that eventually this won't happen anymore. And so, and then that moment comes in 1936.
Well, so you understand that in any language, including Russian, so if you say chestnut, it's not always clear what it means, right?
Yeah.
So, and in Russian, going back a while, there's still this duality, which chestnut can mean private, or individualizing private, and it can also mean selfish. It could mean both, right? And that never goes away also. If you go in the latter direction, then you can look at it as private as a subdivision of the socialist or of the state, right? Meaning this is you taking that part of what's different. It doesn't mean you're separating from the state. You see what I'm saying? It's not taken outside of state ownership. It's not taken out of state law. It's not taken out of the Soviet polity, right?
Well, but I think from what I've seen, the way chestnut was defined legally, it was, because it was specifically not state property. There was that distinction in the law, which would not be between socialist and personal. So the personal property, I absolutely agree with you, exactly.
So wait, so how, if you're in a Soviet socialist system, which involves, I'm glad we're having this conversation about it. It helps me a lot. So if you're in a Soviet socialist system, in which there's ultimate ownership by the state over everything, which is established already in 1918, 1919, right?
It is?
Yeah. Look at Anne O'Donnell's writings. Have you read her?
Some, yeah.
I mean, she describes the practice of how this comes to pass, right, as an example.
But legally, it's not.
Legally, it is. Everything's been nationalized, and so there's
Well, productive forces have been nationalized.
Apartments, farmland.
Well, they're still private property.
Not private.
No, on the books, it's still officially private.
Not as we understand private property.
But it's, I mean, well, okay, sorry, go on. Yeah.
So part of the confusion is that when we say private, what we mean is that it has absolute rights of separation from something else, right? Which of course doesn't exist anywhere in practice. It's created, it's brought into being. So that you have to imagine it as, cutting it off from the rest, putting it off to a separate sphere, and there it cannot be touched, theoretically.
Sure.
We're talking 17th century England, where it also didn't exist, but they said it did, right? So, and in that sense, it's defined by its immunities. Now, if you were to then look at that in relation to Soviet practice, and I think the word also, laws, it doesn't quite say that, right? It says that you can benefit from it. You can have basically a license, which is what the 1920s are, a license to do what you want with it, but this can't be revoked, and it is.
Sure. In that sense, in the sense that that's what I meant when I said it was an absolute.
So all this happens within the plane of state ownership. Sort of the general.
But it's, I mean, the thing is, there is 20 years of struggle for state ownership until they can establish this monopoly. It's a huge, it's a long, drawn-out enclosure movement that they're working on. And for that, they really need to take people's private property. And they're still recognizing, I mean, officially on the books, it's recognized as private property, which is why they need to go through great theoretical loopholes to explain why retail sale is okay. Otherwise, they would need to, right? Otherwise, it will just be like, well, actually, this is state property anyway. But with the caveat that private rights are granted only to further ultimately socialist construction, and there is no, the state doesn't see any independent value in such rights. Okay, let me say this. Practically, I completely agree with you,
Yeah.
but formally there is that distinction, which I think is very interesting. Because it will be surpassed in 1936. So if you look at the history of law, I think it's actually a super interesting thought process that they get to.
So we'll try another way.
Yeah.
So, and I'm not saying that, I'm not saying
But
this
practically, I
because,
completely agree with you.
what's that?
But in practice, I agree.
But in theory also, so imagine that you have this space which becomes the Soviet Union,
Yeah.
right? And it is a physical space and it's a polity.
Mhm.
It's organized as Soviets, and the Soviets are not a hierarchy of separate areas.
Mhm.
Soviets are integral vertical institutions, right? And horizontal, but they're integral. Meaning, by definition, they don't have an outside, right? You know what I'm saying? So it's not like, the old regime where you have the autocrat in St. Petersburg, and then you have provinces, and then you have villages, and all that, which are sort of separate and interacting with each other. This one doesn't recognize that it's integral. It's a modern state, in other words, like the modern state, because it's integral. And the question is, how are you going to put into practice this notion of unity, or what they're calling at the time, unitary, unified, and how you put this into practice, and what will it mean in practice? And so what they later called war communism was, well, everything needs to be mobilized, and we have to break down all barriers. That's why they can go into a village, shoot the peasants, and take their grain. Because the state has the right to do that, because the peasants are not outside the state, right? Right?
Yeah.
You're with me?
But, yeah.
So then obviously this works, but only up to a point, and the new economic policy is saying, we're going to allow people to use certain mechanisms of possession and enrichment and individual accumulation in order to bring the economy back into production, which they achieved, of course, by 1925, 1926. Still within the context of state property. I mean, there's no recognition of a separate sphere, right? And nor am I saying this is a bad thing, right? I'm saying, it's a modern state, right? More modern than most, if you look at it that way. And so that doesn't work for different reasons, circumstantial and whatnot. And then you get into the early 1930s and finally 1936, and they say, well, this is what it's going to look like. So it's a negotiation within the terms of Soviet power. Right?
But they go into the village and they shoot the peasants, but the peasants don't need to be collectivized.
They what?
They still need to be collectivized.
Yeah.
And so it's not like automatically all peasants are just on the collective farms.
No.
There's a long process of negotiation to, which includes shooting peasants. It also includes taking land, giving it to other people, the people in the farms and stuff. But there's and legally, state property includes it includes basically all the productive forces that have been nationalized and livings that have been nationalized and all that stuff. And then there's this other thing called collective property, which includes the collective farms. And then there's private property. But officially, okay, there's частная собственность. Officially, but if you look at the law, that's what it says. If you look at the 1922 Civil Codex, they have those. It's a tripart.
Look at the decree on land in 1917. I mean, they say it. This land does not belong to the peasants. The land belongs to
the land, yes, but I think the implements belong to the collective farm.
No, we're talking about 1917.
Oh.
Collective farms are non-existent.
No, I'm saying if you look at the 1922 Civil Codex, there's a tripart definition of ownership.
Okay, for collective farms.
For everything, there's state property, collective property, and private property. Ownership is defined for those three terms.
But it's not a private property we recognize, or nor do we need to. Where it's it's set up in entirely different terms, which is to say, it's just one. There's one land fund, there's one property fund. The people, it all belongs to one, and the question is, how do we work in this system to make it work, to give one another outcome?
But let me keep pushing my party line here. Okay, so if you just look at the Civil Codexes, right? 1922 and 1926, the tripart definition of ownership.
Right.
State, collective, and private. Right? They recognize that private property is a property relation meant for extinction. Right? And that eventually we will get rid of it, and that it's really even difficult to think of it in the same terms of ownership because they're not really the same. People are writing about this, right? That it's not really absolute, right? But it's still on the books. It still exists, and in fact, it exists and it causes problems. That's what they have to write about. If it just wasn't a problem, it wouldn't be a problem. But by 1932, I mean, it wouldn't be a cost per degree, right? After 1932, after this new collective property is established as the sacred basis of the Soviet order, they start saying, look, these other two, state and collective, are like a united front against private possession. Which is why that law is so draconian, the anti-Gleaning law. And then this new property relation could be established, which actually, you're totally right, then has no conflict. It is one, in which we all have rights.
There's also the term imущество, which is not the same as собственность.
That's right.
Right. So it's not quite property, it means possession.
Yeah.
Right. I would look at these things.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
think it through, yeah. And we need him, who's our specialist in among other things, American public utilities.
Hi.
Hi. So I apologize because I read your paper really fast, and of course I read
thanks for
it
reading it.
in that way that you read it for like what catches my eye and abuses me.
Sure.
So I'm working on a project right now about the kind of history of extraction and kind of resource extraction in the 20th century in the U.S. And I've been trying to unpack this idea of, for myself, really at this point, just to start writing about the idea of corruption, kind of why does corruption end up being the way that people understand kind of this, kind of the private management of public resources. So I'm wondering if you could I found that the section in here on kind of how the kind of scholarly writing about corruption and then the popular understandings of corruption to be really, really, powerful and exciting. But I was wondering, can you unpack kind of why it is that people that you're talking to are seeing kind of Gazprom as corrupt, and where do the resources kind of fit into that idea of, where does the gas fit into the idea of corruption? Is that this is a kind of public, a shared property that is being kind of rechanneled for private, for individual ends, or is it kind of something else? So I'm just wondering, and how that kind of compares to the really small scale, the person who has, they've got a tin of caviar in the back, right? So they're corrupt.
There was a poster up in St. Petersburg a couple of years ago which said, Russia is the land of opportunity, Россия страна возможностей, and people who lived in Soviet Leningrad, a few of them noticed this and laughed, and they said, the thing is, they would always say the Soviet Union is the land of equal opportunity. So I think that's sort of, a lot of that explains why Gazprom is seen as corrupt, right? Because it's sort of, there's sort of almost three levels on which the economy works right now in Russia. There is sort of the Gazprom level, which is you pay for everything formally, and you pay through your nose. It's like crazy American prices, basically. You've got American hospitals, American prices. Funny, I had to get my car. I have a car in Russia, and I hadn't had one before. So I was in Russia. You don't need to get safety checked. You get safety checked, but it's checked by your insurance. So as long as basically when the cop stops you, he just wants to see that you have the insurance, and you don't have to get emissions. So I was in this moment where I still had registration on the car. So I still had insurance, but my safety had lapsed. And so I called a couple of people, and they're like, "You're probably fine. It's not a big deal." But I thought I would see how the law worked. So I asked around about how people got their safety, and everybody said, "Well, we don't actually check. We never go to the state safety checking point. We just have this insurance agent who will just sign off." And I was like, "No, but come on, somebody must do this here."
Because that's how we get our driver's licenses in Greece. You know that, right?
At one point, I found somebody who told me that yes, he actually does go the official route. He worked as a notary. He was really into the law. But we were at a dinner, drinking, and the woman next to us, who had quite a bit to drink, actually thought that he didn't understand my question. that she tried to convince him that I was asking not about the state safety inspection, but about like the, the official like checkup, the yearly checkup you get for your new car. It took us forever to explain what we meant, because she was like, no, nobody gets this stuff, like what are you talking about? So when I took my car to the dealership, I asked, like I said, my safety is expired, could you do it for me? And they said, well, we could. We'd have to charge you 2,000 rubles. Why don't you just take it to the state place and they'll charge you like 700. And then I kept asking around, and I eventually, everybody was like, well, let me just give you the number of my guy, my insurance guy. And I got one of these numbers, and I called the lady, and I recommended myself from the person who gave me the number. And she said, no problem, take a photograph of your tires, take a photograph of the odometer, send me the passport and the driving license, and let's meet tomorrow. And we met. And she gave me the papers. She charged me 1,500, which is exactly midway. So there's justice, So there's basically three, as far as I can tell, three economic levels. There's the Gazprom level, which is everything's done formally and everything's super expensive. There's the using public institutions, which is cheap or free, but takes forever. And then everybody who can does this, using personal contacts to get through public institutions. So this is not corrupt. Right, this is good, and if you have people who know doctors, for example, that's good. And a lot of it, like so, I've seen this happen with friends of mine, just as I've known them as we lived together. They're really not paying, seriously. They're actually they're good at talking to people. And actually, like the doctors, they're also good people. And if you can just explain the situation, I mean, people are willing to be friends. I mean, you can for friends, there's possibilities to do that. People who have neither money nor an ability to talk, like the old people that are just sort of, but they might have a lot of time on their hands and they could just wait in the clinics or whatever and stuff. But they're kind of screwed. And the Gazprom people, the reason that everybody else who's not in Gazprom would say that they're corrupt is because it's sort of the ideal forest institution to work for. It's if you make it in there, you get high salaries, by the way their salaries are classified. I've talked to middle managers who they said, we'll tell you what we can. One thing we can't tell you about is how much we get paid, because we signed a confidentiality agreement. So they must get paid a lot. So I know. They get paid a lot. They get paid white, which means like the company pays all the taxes on their salaries, which means they get a social benefit package. Most other people I know who work for smaller companies get half of their salaries in white envelopes, because nobody will be able to afford taxes, which is fine. But I mean, that means that they don't always get their money on time, because their money has to get laundered. It has to somehow be taken out to be given as cash and salaries. And it also means that they know they're not going to get pensions, because social services isn't being paid. So Gazprom, they get like an amazing benefits package, they get full retirement, they get absolutely everything. It's fantastic, beautiful, shiny sort of thing, which is super good for those people who are selling our gas, but only for them. So I think that's sort of and to get in, you really have to know somebody. Plus, you have to be vetted by the security state, and it's a really,
Did you say it's super good for the people who are selling our gas?
Yeah.
So that's the understanding. Since it's our gas, and then the benefits are leading up to these people that have the connection and can be legal formally.
Exactly.
But so there's entirely the possibility of being legal and corrupt at the same.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So from the standpoint of a lot of people I talk to, Gazprom is like the epitome of corruption, because I mean, like the only reason they have money is because they're selling our resources, and we don't even know how much they get paid. Like there's a big problem there. From the standpoint of the law and of like the political scientists at Harvard, it's fine. It's totally above board. Yeah.
Transparency.
Yeah.
I haven't read your introduction, so sorry, but because you used the title Gleaning, I was wondering how, if you had like a small story about gleaning, and I know like in France there are laws about gleaning, and it always seems throughout history to be a very emotional point, with sort of all kinds of other things going wrong around it, but then coming down on gleaning or very petty pilfering sets off a big thing, and that has like been happening, as far as I know, since the Dutch East India Company, but I'm sure before that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Gleaning is a fascinating concept, which I sort of came into kind of late. But it's really fascinating because if you go by Leviticus, the Leviticus definition, right, it's not just the right to scavenge the leftovers.
Yeah.
It's also the obligation to leave a remainder on the fields that would be taken. Right, so it's actually an obligation to set aside a remainder that would be ethically redistributed. And in sort of the history of socialist property law, that law in 1932 that outlaws gleaning for the private good, that draconian anti-theft law, right, and sets this sacred monopoly of socialist property, it really creates an ethical obligation for everybody to glean for the common, because this thing doesn't work, actually. So that I just mentioned in response to a question that there is kind of a space of indeterminacy between in this planned economy between the quota of socialist property that you're supposed to get and the way you actually get it and what you actually get, and that space of indeterminacy could be personally managed. That is the place of gleaning. So that basically, if you're in a shortage economy, your main problem is getting stuff. And so you want to get as much stuff as soon as you can get it, and you want to stockpile it if you're not using it right away. So everybody was hoarding. But then you've got these hoards. So that hoarding, that's leaving intentionally a remainder on the fields. Right? So everybody's hoarding, and then you've got these hoards, and you can ethically redistribute them for the collective. Interestingly, though, of course, this is an economy of managers. It's a user-flipped economy, an economy of managers, and it's an economy of gleaners. But interestingly, it's an economy of gleaners that are all gleaning from the sacred monopoly and for the sake of the sacred monopoly. My answer your question.
Yes. Sure.
Thanks. Yeah, at least until Petersburg, when people can start gleaning for the good of their collective.
Can I just ask something quickly about the 1932 law, which I really don't actually know that much about, but I mean, when you're talking about the motivations behind it, you're talking about the idealized outcome from the perspective of the state of what the law would do? When you're saying, well, how you just described the law is that this anti-gleaning law would, what would the ethics of that be in your?
Actually, no. I just meant that in this law, this is the first time that collective property is called the sacred order, the sacred basis of the Soviet order.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Collective property.
It is still called collective property, but then by 33, civil law scholars are calling it socialist property. So it's just that the terms have get solidified in the discourse.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
Oh, but this is coming out of famine, right?
It's coming out of a massive the state's massive enclosure movement. The state's attempt to dispossess everybody of everything for the sake of the sacred monopoly.
Mm-hmm.
And as they're in the thrust of collectivization, as they're dispossessing everybody, they want to make sure that people don't steal, basically. So yeah, so it's basically
the people
the
who
state
are
takes everything.
dealing, because you're talking about hoarding, but you're saying that that's from the state's perspective, that they view what people are doing as hoarding.
Well, so they don't even need to hoard. For in this law, it's any theft. It's literally the theft of 2 grains. 2 stalks of grain is already theft.
Mm-hmm.
This law outlaws any theft, no matter how minor, within punishment with death. So it's a completely draconian dispossession law.
But the target of it is peasants who are dealing with famine, dealing with
everybody, including
state, but
yeah.
like in the context that it's coming out of.
Yeah. So so you're saying how does this lead to the ethical redistribution?
Yes.
Yeah. So in this 32 law, for the first time, you have a property relation called the sacred basis of the Soviet order. This property relation that would be called then socialist property, right? So basically, the socialist household is based on an enclosure movement, right? Just like sort of capitalist market economies are based on an enclosure movement. But it's dispossession, right? But it's not the dispossession of one class for the benefit of another. It dispossesses everybody for the sake of those who successfully joined the state-led economy, right? And by 1936, they declared the state-led economy based on the sacred basis of socialist property. But this state-led economy is a planned one, and a very poorly functioning one, very poorly planned one. For it to function at all, people need to hoard and redistribute.
I think what Kate is asking is that, it's not an abstract law, it's situated in those circumstances of famine and draconian crackdown. Is that? That's what
Right,
it
I mean, to me, that seems like it's important to
Oh, sure.
the story.
No, absolutely. But it's, yeah, of course. It's a famine caused by this dispossession that the state has been frantically putting down. And it's sort of like the last and most ostentatious move in that long dispossession movement. Does that make sense? I don't know. Did I not answer?
Yeah, no, I
Just, I mean, too, that
Yeah.
was periodically reaffirmed, like in 1941.
Oh, sure.
1947.
Yeah, sure.
So, I mean, it kind of ebbs and flows in terms of its effort.
Definitely. Yeah.
Those are also years of
Yeah.
famine.
Of course.
Yeah.
Well,
So
40
is that why you chose them?
Well, no, I mean, I chose them literally because they actually
Yeah.
refer to these laws directly in orders to the army and various works and acts. They actually refer directly back to this law. That's like, refer to this law to understand what will happen to you if you take socialist property. And there, that's not just about famine. That's also about like the general collapse of government institutions in 1941, and then about famine in 1947.
Yeah, totally.
Right, but I just feel like that the fact that the law is being reaffirmed in these specific times.
Well, of course, famine, people are more likely to steal when their kids are dying. Right? So, if you're in a famine situation in which you really want to keep is not kids from dying, but the state from losing anything, then you make it, you punish it very harshly. So of course it will be reaffirmed in 41. But it's also a famine caused by, it's not just like there was a famine. It was a famine itself caused by this dispossession process.
Right.
So in a way, in that sense, that's what I meant when I said the law is like the last sort of most ostentatious move of this dispossession process. Although, yeah, of course, it's like it has been underlined that thou shalt not steal for private gain, And Andropov also is another crackdown. Less maybe draconian, although people did get executed, high-level people, but
I
yeah.
just wonder, because it's like,
Sorry.
oh, sorry. I was just
Go ahead.
like, it's like this tension between like, yeah, I struggle with this also, but it's, like I'm very, when talking about this law, I'm just sort of really facing this, like, people are happily, people are getting on and they're like providing for their friends and their collectives, and there's like nested collectives, which then is like, so I guess like point one then is that you kind of talk about this like post-Soviet fracturing of the sacred monopoly into many collectives which may or may not be opposed to each other, and your understanding of whether it's like collective, like whether it's kind of mutual interest or whether it's stealing is based on your relationship to the collective that has the thing.
Yeah.
So then, but then even in the Soviet period, there were, like as we know, like nested collectives, some of which had greater access to things than didn't. So then the understanding of whether this was kind of based in ethics would still also depend on your relationship to a specific collective. But like overall, it was like overall existed within this like legally existing ethical framework, right? So that's kind of. But it's just, I wonder if this maybe just didn't like. I think it's important to be clear that this like the fracturing of collectives and the opposition of collectives is happening like it's happening in the Soviet period as well as the post-Soviet period, and then especially like as we're talking about this war so much, it's like this property relation in which people were able to like sort of care for each other and their collectives was created by a law that killed people, basically, right? And that this line of like, again, it's like the line of like, are you stealing in order to, like, are you stealing to feed your children? Is that like a private, that's like classified as like private gain? But in fact, like, that could be said like, I'm protecting my future members of the collective farm, right? Which is like a collective gain. So I do think like this sort of like nesting of like the personal property relation within kind of the public, and that like the removal of the dichotomy that is you're showing like existed sort of both in people's practice but also within the legal framework is very important. And I think that then you probably gonna have things to say kind of about like what is the economy anyway, like in kind of more theoretical term in your just like. This is not as if like this is, in the Soviet case is like a specific case, but this overlap of like an economy functioning as if it's a household, and an economy functioning as if it's like a theoretically perfect economy.
As opposed to market.
As opposed to a
I
market.
mean, both the households also theoretically perfect. Households.
Right.
Both have theoretically perfect
Yeah,
versions.
but that
Just
kind of-
they're very different images of what an economy should be.
Yeah.
A household or a market. One is, you know, going somewhere, the other one's
Another
headless.
one's going headless.
Yeah.
Um,
But I mean, as far as the violence, of course, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what I'm saying. There's two great moments of dispossession, and there's a big violence. There's a huge enclosure movement that allows the creation of the state and monopoly of socialist prosperity, upon which then this other type of household economy is based. Which is then I mean, I'm so happy to find that it's the 1932 law, because of course it's just so poetic. I mean, a new form of gleaning opened up by the very law that harshly, ultimately disallows this private form of gleaning. So it's like, the zero moment.
This is something Foucauldian. It actually is, yeah.
So I got a question. Yeah.
So just to follow up on all that, so that makes me think that there must be some, I know you don't want to talk about chronology specifically, or you don't want to talk about chronology, but it seems to me that that's like, that you have to map chronologically when the middle, like this household economy is possible, because definitely it's not possible in 32 when the law is established. And it does depend on like the state of famine and the state of punitive law, and like how many people are sent to the gulag, and whether there is, what's that word, damn it, prophylactica, like the rise of prophylactica definitely makes it easier
So
for this
totally.
for this household economy to exist. Whereas like in 41, probably it disappears again and then reappears.
So totally fascinating. I mean, fascinating that you would go to prophylactica, because prophylactica is one of the it literally just means like prophylaxis, or prophylactics. Yeah, I mean, and it's part of the 1960s reforms, right? Where basically what Khrushchev says, I mean, really starting in 1956, but between like, especially by 1959, which basically 56 and 61, the platform 61 is implemented, is that look, now socialism is built and Stalin's dead. And now the development of communism can become a non-violent process of growth. And so we actually have no more political crimes in the country. He says he's wrong. There are actually lots of still people being prosecuted for political crimes, but that's what he says. And so we don't really need a police state anymore, right? We just now have like minor crimes and misdemeanors, and society can deal with those through prophylactica and through comrades courts and through the people's patrols. And the dealing with it can be a moral thing. And at this point, the collectivist ethics, this is in 1961, as part of the third-party platform, we get the moral codex of the builders of communism. And it's this collectivism, which had been around in Stalin's time too. We know this from the oral histories collected by the Harvard Oral Interview Project, for example. I mean, there's like Harvard collected hundreds of interviews with people who had escaped the Soviet Union during World War II, and through all of these, and with all sorts of different people, like basically from collective farm members to high-level managers. And there's these two themes that keep running through those interviews. There's terror of unpredictable policing, and there's the ethics of which back then often is talked about as ZIS, знакомство и связи, which is an acronym for the plant that would become ZIL. It's a big automobile plant, so it's kind of a pun. It was called the factory named after Stalin, and then Khrushchev makes Stalin's name unmentionable, and it becomes the factory named after Ligachev. So I would say like in sort of the one place to put the socialist household is post-60s, because this is really when officially the law would wither away after collectivism is perfected. But before too, from Stalin's time, I mean, there is a lot of work that's been done about how the Soviet project was thought about as one big family, for example. The хозяин in the world economy, and it's definitely it's also definitely there. It's just it's not formally recognized in a way. The collectivist ethic isn't as formally recognized as it would have been in the 60s. That's what I would say.
Yeah. The question is taking this step aside. I wonder if you have insights from from your work on the concept, the notion of private property in Soviet socialism. So about what happened in the 90s, privatization of that socialist property. And I also come from the field of cinema studies, and I'm interested in particular in the fate of the regional film studios that all at once became private property, and but to whom the films belong, for example, to whom the intellectual property belongs is very unclear. So I wonder if there are thoughts you've had on that part of the history.
So thanks. Yeah, it's so my reading of this would be that by the time the official privatization reforms begin in the 90s, like 91, 92, I mean that's the Soviet Union falls apart. The sacred basis of the Soviet order, socialist property, has already been personalized, right? Because the earlier reforms, Gorbachev's reforms, which were implemented in 87, 88, the law about enterprises and the law about cooperatives, which basically mandated all the individual collectives, all the enterprises, to use the excesses of socialist property, the hoarded stockpile stuff they have, for the good of their particular collectives. And yet this was an economy without market price. So they still have to sell at state set prices. And if you do that, basically, if they're mandated to do stuff for their collectives, which is what they do. And the best way you can do stuff for your collectives in that system is to form basically these huge usufruct monopolies, where you redistribute the stuff you're entitled to, the socialist property, for the good of your particular collectives. Basically, you preferentially deal, you trade preferentially. So, if I'm getting paid the same amount no matter who I sell to, it's better for me to sell to you because you can get me stuff that I would then redistribute to my collective, or that I would then give to other people who can get me stuff for my collective, because suddenly now I need to pay them and all this stuff. And so by the time privatization actually begins, really, the economy is already informally sort of set up in these huge suzerainities, as Karen Humphrey would call them. So really, it's through those suzerainities that privatization goes. So I would say that's who gets the stuff.
Basically, the rise of corporations.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and they could be either regional monopolies or enterprise monopolies, and sometimes they're both.
With managerial power.
Yeah. But the thing to point out is that this was set up before privatization hit.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Do you know Michael Hertzfeld?
Yeah.
You do? On corruption? What he's written on corruption?
Yeah.
Because part of what you're saying is that spaces are created where people can do things. His argument, obviously in a different context, is that what we call corruption is a way of people feeling empowered, that they can actually do things, because they have direct access to power, they have direct access to influence, and even if, the example he's giving, you bring an envelope to the doctor, who's supposed to be free, or to your MP, the payment, or to your bureaucrat, what you're doing actually is really feeling confident that you can actually have an effect, because you can bribe them, right?
Yeah. Although the doctor thing is interesting because it's at least what I've seen is it's pretty much genuinely a gift. It's pretty. I mean, the cases that I know, it's not people.
Well, that's the thing. These aren't necessarily bribes.
Yeah, they're not really bribes.
Yeah.
And there's actually there's a lot of sort of negotiation about, well, how do you give money, because it's awkward to give money, and so it's better if you can give something else, or maybe you can give a book and slip a bill into the book, and it's really maybe you can ask somebody else to give it for you. So it's sort of like, well, I feel like I ought to give something, but I don't really know how to do it.
Yeah, it's awkward, but doable. So the difference between saying that someone's given a space, which they occupy, on the one hand, is part of an argument. Another one is actually what motivates them to be active participants in something. And part of what makes them active participants is they think this is a way of expressing, gaining, empowering, all these things.
Yeah. Or expressing gratitude. If I'm genuinely grateful to you, I want to give you something.
You're welcome. Yeah.
There is also that. Like, somebody saves my life, like I might want to give that person something.
No, I can see this permeates your work.
Yeah.
There is such thing as a genuine feeling of
Yeah.
collectivism, a genuine feeling of a group, a genuine feeling of gratitude, that there is such a thing, right?
Which doesn't mean that it's not used cynically, also. There is also cynicism, but there is also...
Unlike like individualism, right? Okay. I was being sarcastic. Yeah.
Speaking of doctors, I know that Xenia describes it really well. You've seen the book probably on informal connections, so she has a few case studies and from which it really follows that the art of navigating and understanding to whom you should give money and to whom it should be some kind of service or just a thank you. Really is really what got people far.
Xenia, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. The interesting thing about her work, and I mean, this whole literature on second economies, is that they specifically look at blood. So I mean, it's totally interesting and it's totally legit, but it looks at what people should not do, which doesn't really tell you what they should do, but what they do. It just tells you what they should not do. So it doesn't really show you how the system works so much as it works, you know. Yeah, it shows you how people think it ought not work. You know?
But with like the Fitzpatrick work that I was talking about,
Yeah.
the whole point is that, you know, I don't like this person, they have blood.
Yeah.
You and I are friends, we do each other favors, it's
Yeah.
not blood, that's something else.
Yeah.
And that's normal, and that's how it functions, right? I mean, that kind of looking at it positionally seems to go back all the way at least to the 30s. And the perception of it as positional based on, I benefit from this, and this is my friend, you know. I bring you a bottle of vodka, we drink it, we figure something out together. It's different than I bring that guy who I don't like a bottle of vodka, I don't drink it with him, and he does something.
Sure, yeah. No, completely agree, yeah. Completely agree. I mean, I guess my only intervention in that whole discussion is to say, well, interestingly, is it interesting that the positive side of it, you know, I bring you about we talk about it is actually, it's what sort of the socialist household ought to be doing. So, but yeah, but completely.
And I think, I see what you're doing is different, but it's
Yeah.
just quite, you know, I was just thinking like an unsympathetic reader might be like, and so what is new about this? And I think you have a lot that's new about this, but it's interesting that that term also never comes up because it's so ingrained in the literature as we know it thus far.
Yeah, it is so loaded.
I mean, you are kind of like the anti-blot here.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, totally well taken. I mean, I think blood, like nostalgia, is, I mean, they're just loaded terms. I want to avoid them, but actually, maybe I should just take them on, you know, at least explain.
I mean, I like what you said about nostalgia, the nostalgia's the longing for something that never was, and you're like, no, it really was, right? I mean, I just feel like...
But it's still an idealized, sorry. I mean, like, there is no what it really was. Like, it's still an idealized version of what it was.
As is everything, or just this?
No, as is everything.
Right.
Especially in the realm of when you're applying ethics to things, like that ramps it up a little.
But in the sense, look, but in the sense, here's what I try to say, I guess, in self-justification. In the sense that ethics is always idealized, right? If these narratives, something of what I want to say is that these narratives are themselves an expression of collectivist ethics. When people say this is Soviet times, and they give you this collectivist narrative, that isn't just a description of socialist ethics; it's an expression of socialist ethics. And in that sense, yeah, sure, it's idealized the way all ethics is idealized, but it's not like a yearning for a past that never was. It's an expression of an ethical stance, which was actually central to the way this economy ran.
I think we just have two different understandings of what the past is. and it's okay if we do.
But also where this past begins, how much of it is Soviet and how much it begins earlier.
So what she's raising now, there was that whole subfield of history, which is what's called memory studies, right? But memory studies is sort of like it's integrated into the way we do history, right? So, you know, if you're standing in 1988 and you're looking back, or no, 1918, and you're looking back on 1988, and you think that at that time there was, you know, you could find food, there was shelter, we helped each other, despite all the problems, we were happy, and so on and so forth. Kind of like the Blitz. In fact, there's a book called The Myth of the Blitz, and it's about that, right? And they're not saying that it's not true, nor are they saying that it's like, they could be saying, they're not necessarily saying it's nostalgia, they're saying that somehow your recollections whether you actually remember them or not, because you could have seen it in someone else's recollections. But these are as real as anything else. And the question is, how do you organize these things into what they'll call a myth, capital M, right? Not myth as in something untrue, but myth as in a structuring and an ordering of all of this information, right? So I think it's perfectly plausible to say that in 1988 people were better off than in 1995, most people, I would say. Now is that nostalgia? It could be. It's certainly memory. And someone else who says, no, things were not available. No, the doctors were not easy to find. No, I did not have a good apartment. That's also memory.
Yeah, sure. I would not disagree with that.
Just wanted to follow up on that. I think your guys' disagreement is about whether the main subject of your book is about post-Soviet or Soviet. Because if you're mostly writing about the post-Soviet period, then memory is a totally valid way to approach it. Memory, nostalgia, whatever. But if you're writing a history also, then the question what really happened, I think it does matter.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I'm actually, most of the book is about this property relation and how it worked, sort of in theory and in practice.
So in the past as well.
In the past, yeah. And so the present is important because basically these ethnographic vignettes, these narratives give me the ethical stakes with which then I go into the archives and which I then find. So I was actually quite surprised to find them all over the place. So yeah, that's
It's just, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I just lived through this project for a long time, and I love it and great respect for it. But it just second time in a week, I think I stumbled in the same situation. I think it's an epistemological question, right? That's what we talked about 2010 and the history and anthropology, right? It would be no claim to for Xenia to make without the fieldwork. So that's where the things start. And then how you design the approach to the past, it is through the informants. However, nostalgia ended up being, at least in anthropological literature and ethnographic literature, a kind of way of talking about the present. And it became, over the decades, in kind of post-socialist studies especially, this kind of way of describing this past before, through actually talking to the informants. And I think what Xenia does very well here, and I fully agree with that, is she says, well, I'm not using those stories to reconstruct the past. This is not what I'm doing. And I think that's very important, that kind of epistemological, anthropological choice, because there are people doing exactly that. There are many, and in that way she's closer to the history than many of our colleagues. On the other hand, there is something also, I do follow the second part of the critique, which goes between us for a long time. Once her analysis of the history kicks in, then it's the question, if you're reading this history, which I think you do, and it's interesting as a kind of symptomatic reading, that those laws are not foundational as much as also kind of telling, and they're also kind of, in certain ways, stories.
An occasion.
Yeah, an occasion. And in that way, this is kind of, both are kind of anthropological choices, they're highly interesting, but they're, once she claims that that was how it was based on that law, then if you're kind of closer to history, and then the question of ordering kicks in. But when it's about what anthropologists do, tell other people's stories in their own terms, that's what they do. Then it's actually, both of those choices are incredibly interesting, and interesting in anthropological terms, because when it starts even almost kind of in a class study of the object, right? It starts in this kind of anthropological sort of how you got this bottle. And in that way, those are stories which then open all of this in this kind of way. We do things. Otherwise, we will be... And I hate when anthropologists act as amateur historians. That's horrible, because then we use history as a kind of...
Anthropologists can be good historians.
But the way we get ourselves into this historical stuff, I do something similar in a different place. It's through the different kind of epistemological question. And probably then 2010 is the question of anthropology, right? When we start discussing things today. It's how ethnography kicks in, how ethnography opens the world. Yeah, sorry.
When you mean a symptomatic reading of history,
It just as a story is a certain kind of understanding it, not in a structural state analysis way, not a Benjamin Moore, right? But everything else, like because you said it yourself, it's like well, probably because it was famine. So this kind of way of storytelling, and especially because legal studies have such a complicated relationship to all studies of socialism. You can say that like. I don't know if many of your subjects are even aware of those laws.
Oh, yeah, no.
In that sense,
Yeah,
right,
yeah,
right.
yeah.
So in that sense, they're symptomatic. They
Yeah,
have
yeah,
its
yeah.
own effect, and
Yeah.
you're finding them in the stories, and they come in the stories, and they go from the story. But they're not
Yeah.
liberal,
Yeah.
you know, like, it's very easy to be Foucauldian in the liberal society. That's one thing against Michel Foucault, because you read the law and you know the stuff.
You've been reading Engelstein, yeah.
No, I mean, definitely most people have no idea that there's a difference between personal property and private property. At all, actually. It doesn't really register.
What does that imply?
They just their stuff. I mean, you know, that it doesn't, I mean, they notice, they obviously noticed like the Soviet Union collapsing, and they notice the Soviet being a certain kind of ethical regime as well as a property regime, but as far as, do you know that in 1992 your personal car became your private car?
Yes.
Yeah.
It was one of the most successful reforms carried out. In fact, one of the only successful reforms carried out in the early 90s. But I like the way it's being suggested is that, you know, so to what extent does history matter to an anthropologist? And I said in this project it does, right?
Of course.
And it's good, you know. And so it's good that you're here in a group of historians who can alert you to some of the pitfalls to make it better, right? That's why it's a work in progress. So in this case, it's good to bear in mind. So is it worth arguing about the origins of the concept of socialist property and state property versus private property? Is it important to your project, or is it more important to say that socialist property came into being, right? It's a historical creation, in other words. And what really matters for you is the 80s, right? Or if that's what it is. So without getting into, you know, and then similarly, laws are not causal, nor are they ontologically real. They're symptoms, they're stopping points on your way to the main point, which is the 80s, right?
Well, the post-60s.
Okay. And then similarly, you know, the invention of the economy and fixing the economy, Tim Mitchell, we can have endless historical debates about when it actually was, and as I said, you're not a historian, you don't have to, you know. And even historians should be getting involved in these debates, because they're such a waste of time sometimes. What you want to say, what we all want to say, is that the economy was brought into being in this form, which is new. Now, when exactly, we can put aside for the moment, right? You know what I'm saying? So that kind of historical sensibility is necessary, right? But not the reconstructing of the, oh my God, you know, sort of.
No, she doesn't do that. It's such a fascinating project.
What do you think?
Thanks.
Yeah? All right. Thank you.